Hi there, and welcome to Al and Merrill.
My name is Merel, and I like to do deep dives into the latest research on neurodiversity.
And I'm Alistair, psychotherapist. I love creating metaphors and stories to help make sense of it all. And together we're going to be exploring the fascinating world of how neurodiversity shapes our lives. So let's dive in. So this episode of Al and Merrill is brought to you by mycopilot.ai for when your willpower won't. So you know those 2 a.m. moments when you're caught doom scrolling and you know that you should really be going to bed? Or the sofa after work where you've collapsed and you're stuck on your phone? Well, My Copilot AI is your personal AI co-pilot that will help you get on with the things that you really want and need to do in those moments, whether that's doing the laundry, getting on with your projects or hobbies, or going to bed. Check it out at mycopilot.ai.
Just a note to say that we're explorers and storytellers. This podcast is not intended as therapy, advice, recommendation, or medical authority. We are just like you, inviting you along on our journey of trying to make a little sense out of fascinating research on neuroscience and neurodiversity as best as we can.
Hi.
Hey.
So I'm going to carry on with what I was saying. So for the benefit of our listeners, we've actually just sort of launched into a conversation about Christmas and families and how challenging that can sometimes be with neurodiversity. So we thought we'd hit record and just share this. So what I was saying just then was, I was talking about skills regression with ADHD and how coping with family can be really impacted by that, because what skills regression is often kicks in about a year after you get your diagnosis and usually lasts for about a year at least, really. And it's when you lose your ability to cope with your day-to-day life. So stuff that you historically would have done to look after yourself and your home environment, you suddenly stop being able to do. So cooking, cleaning, like healthcare routines, they seem to just vanish about a year after getting your diagnosis for a certain number of people. And basically it's because the main reason that we were doing those things, or like the energy behind doing them, was at some level, hey, if I try harder, I can learn to cope and be like neurotypical, and I can, establish a routine and I'll keep it up. Despite all the evidence of my life, this time I'll keep it going. And then you get
Does
your
it
diagnosis.
also apply to masking? It feels like this also happens with masking a lot. Like at least I noticed this after my autism diagnosis, that I was constantly pushing myself to do things that I was supposing was normal to do in conversations and stuff. And at some point, it's easier also to allow yourself, which is good partially, which is good to allow yourself to back off and be kind to yourself, but not too much, because then you will just be isolated. Like you need to find a new way of doing these things.
And I think a big part of it is like your choice and agency. So I think skills regression usually is a really difficult experience because, you were like, but I was able to do this last year. Why can't I do it now? And it's because at some level, your brain's reward system just, like, you don't believe it anymore, right? You know that it's bollocks. You know that it doesn't matter how much energy you put into this. You're not going to keep it up. Your house is going to go right back into being a state afterwards, because with the best will in the world, you'll keep it up for like 2 weeks and then it's all going to fall apart again and you'll have a mess again for like 2 months and then you'll manage another 2 weeks and you just end up going, what? And it's just really hard to motivate yourself. So I think, again, in the social situations or family situations, you kind of just go, this is just bollocks. And it's just really hard to pretend, and it's really hard to make the effort because you don't, at a really basic level, you don't believe that you're going to get the win that you really want, which is the struggle to go away. So you have to basically learn how to root all of this stuff in something much more honest and authentic and believable, which can take some time to discover. So
How did you do that?
Well, I mean, don't look at my house. I'm not sure I have, to be quite honest with you. My house is still a complete state. I've never really got. One thing I'm very acutely aware of, particularly with my work, is that, and I wish I'd done it. A friend of mine very kindly bought me one. I talk a lot about the plasma ball, so I'm going to show you one. Right. Oh no, I'm going to need some scissors to show you. Damn, my lazy ass does not want to. I know where this is. So my friend very kindly, look, he started as a work colleague, become a friend, and he very kindly bought me this and sent it over. Bought it in his luggage from Canada, which is where they make them, because they don't make them over here. And he bought 2 to 3 just in case one of them broke. Bless him. So that, when you plug it in, can I plug it in? Yeah, you can kind of just about see that, can't you? There we go. The point of this is that if you don't touch them, the electricity just does what it wants, right? It goes all over the shop, and it doesn't heat up the glass because it's moving around too much and it's too thin. So there's literally just not enough amount of like wattage or ampage or whatever it is that each one of those filaments creates to actually do any like real work as electricity, which would be heating it up. But if I touch it, suddenly that's actually like, it's still moving around. It's still a bit chaotic, right? It's still a mess, but it's much more consistent. And my fingers are getting warm because the amount of energy now coming down that single filament is much more like, this is getting hot, as in hot. That's an ADHD brain. So when I'm working by myself, that's what happens. I can do a bit and then I'm here. And if I'm very lucky, my autism will kick in and like I'll get really hooked into my coding. And then that's like me doing that to myself. The code keeps me connected. But the best thing that I can do for myself is find people. People do that. The second that there's someone around me, that's what my brain looks like. When they go away, that's what my brain looks like. People know people. People know people. So I genuinely think, and this is something that I encourage my therapy clients, I think that, like at some level, I think that ADHD is like an OG human being. I think we're pre-farming. So there's a little bit of evidence to suggest that this. So very briefly, ADHD is it's a brain that's very well aligned for like a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. You're on and you're off. You're mostly off. You're just kind of switched off. You're waiting for stuff to happen. But then every now and then, when there's ripe fruit, you go and get it. When there's something to go get, you switch on and you go get it. It's actually very energy saving. And you're actually better at like, if there's a series of fruit bushes, you will get bored of the tree that's got fruit on it faster and you will move on to the next tree or the next bush faster, which means that, I don't know if you've ever picked blackberries, but the longer that you stay picking blackberries on a single bush, like less quality there is because you eat all the quality ones straight away. So when you move around a lot, you get much higher food package, you much higher quality food for the same amount of effort that you put in. Whereas someone who doesn't have that kind of brain, who just sits there with the grind, will eat through the whole bush, but the quality of the food that they're eating will reduce. But that attitude of grinding is really good for farming. So basically, it's highly likely that ADHD is actually like our OG brain. It's like what we used to be like, what all human beings used to be like. And then Ice Age happened, farming had to happen because we had to survive, and it was the only way to survive. It was actually a much less effective survival strategy at the time than just before that time. You know, whatever it was that happened that forced us into farming, probably Ice Age. Before that, farming was a bad idea. Evolutionarily speaking, it looks like we still haven't become as healthy post-farming as we were before farming. So we really only did it because we had to. But to do that, you have to stay in one place and have like deferred reward, which neurotypicals are very good at. So our whole world is probably built for neurotypicals because it's built on farming. And farming allows you to build big structures because you can do deferred reward, whereas ADHD is like, la-di-da-di-da, I only care about the right fruit. I'm not going to build civilizations because I don't really care. But the reason that matters for what we were talking about a minute ago with the human impact here, deferred reward doesn't need this. It's independent of this. You kind of like do your own thing. But our OG ADHD brain is designed to be in a tribe. We would have been regulated and regulating ourselves through the rituals and routines and habits of our tribe. We would have always been around our other people. You wouldn't have looked like an ADHD, like lost alone person, because you wouldn't have been. You would have been in your tribe. So one of the reasons my house is a complete mess and I'm looking around is because I live alone. And I'm looking around going, yeah, if I had someone here, I would make all the effort to tidy this up. That's what would wake me up. You know, that's what it would take. So, but then, you know, dating and stuff is complicated when I'm like, okay, no masks. Hold on. What am I trying to project in this flirting date as to what I'm putting on the table? You know, like so much of life before diagnosis, like you say, is masking. That when all that goes away, also all the relational stuff, I'm like, I need to find a new way of doing this. I need to find a new principle for looking after my house. I need to find a new principle for meeting my family at Christmas, because I'm like, yeah, it doesn't work. Like the old way, I can't pretend anymore, you know? So I can't play the old, oh, everything's nice, let's just pretend. It's like, I have a very autistic family. They're very difficult to be around. We get very dysregulated around each other, and we all ask and depend on each other to be our regulatory sources. Like that tribe. It's like, you help me regulate. Well, you put 7 people in a room who are all doing that. All it takes is one person to dysregulate and the whole cascade falls apart. And then everyone's just in a bad mood and dysregulated. And then you're trying to kind of make the other person or the other people help you regulate, because we're kind of going like, basically like, can we be tribe? Can we regulate like a tribe? But if you don't actually live with each other day in, day out, you don't have the rituals, you don't have the routines. You actually can't rely on that regulation because it's not there. You have to make an effort to create it. And that's actually beyond us, mostly in the moment, especially when we're dysregulated. So the whole thing is kind of a mad catch-22, because we all have brains looking like that, and we were completely nuts with each other when we let go of whatever stories we used to tell ourselves to make ourselves make an effort. When they have no more value, when we don't believe them, we can't make ourselves do them.
Would you then hypothesize that neurotypicals became neurotypicals as a result of farming, or that farming appeared as a result of brains developing and becoming what we today call neurotypical?
I suspect it's co-evolution. Also, if you look at latitude, I think latitude's really interesting. So the further north you go, the more reserved people get. Because if you live in the Mediterranean and you have an argument with your family, you can just walk outside. Like, you can just go at any time of year. You can be like, I'm done with you. Fuck off. And you go. And it doesn't break anything, because you come back and you're like, it's fine. You know, and that's one of the reasons I think why Italians shout at each other so much, because it doesn't matter. If you did that in an igloo where you can't go anywhere and you can't escape and you can't regulate and you're completely dependent on each other, that is the most insane risk. You could literally die if you can't get on with someone. And if you're getting stir crazy in a little cabin and you let your emotions come up, someone's getting stabbed, right? Because they're chewing too loudly, you know, or something irritating. And then you literally just kill each other. So I think when the Ice Age hit and everyone's stuck with each other, you have to like shut down. You can't afford to be too exuberant and in the moment. You have to defer your reward. You have to delay your gratification. You have to make do with what is. You can't be this noisy brain. These noisy brains just died, basically, I think, most of them. And what's left is you end up with human beings who are able to like execute some like deep regulation over time. And I think that then is the sort of initial attitude that makes farming possible, but it's also necessary. So the two things kind of just come together and they just feed back to each other. Like, it's a co-evolutionary thing. I don't think one really comes before the other. But I think this marriage of a certain ability to sort of force your own brain into a regulated state, plus the benefits of that with surviving cold and farming, put all those together, and it's like, that's why we survived the Ice Age in the Northern Hemispheres. Although, interestingly, I also think that might be slightly correlated with autism. So I'm like, I think here, you know, as we're discovering, there's a lot of different neurological mechanisms at play in the neurodiversity world. Some of them are, you know, sort of opposite ends of a spectrum. So I don't know. Somewhere in here is some strong influences in our evolutionary history. So yeah, it all ends up at you falling out with family after 3 days at Christmas. I'm also wearing my Christmas jumper today.
Good job. Is it 12th? Oh, but it was for the packaging, the presents.
I just felt like I'm not a Christmas jumper person historically. This isn't like a bad Christmas jumper. I think this is a reasonably...
It's more like a winter one.
It's a winter. It's almost a Nordic winter thing rather than
Yeah.
It's not like... It doesn't have reindeers on it. All right, so that's me and Christmas. Our special Christmas episode. Tell me, what did you have queued up for today that I've just prattled on over?
We were going to go to a new topic, which I'm not sure how to call it. Let's call it neuroplasticity, because you mentioned that you had read some things about the brain not being really divided in areas with specific functions, but that maybe all of the brain was able to do all kinds of things.
I'm not sure it's exactly like that, because I think the kind of like the angle on it was a bit different, which is that we've been looking at the brain from the perspective of each area does a specific thing for reasons. But then a group of researchers was looking at the way that excitations flow around the brain. So you could literally have like a picture of the brain shape, and you can kind of see the wave in like literally wave, like sort of like the front of the wave is like red and yellow, and then the bit where there isn't excitation is like blue, and you can watch how it moves around and the shape of the brain. So all of us have the same shape brain. Like the grooves are in the same places, which is remarkable because like that's really hyper specific. And what they found was that are exploring, I should say, is that the way that the wave moves in the physical space, given the physical architecture of the brain, may be doing some computation, like by virtue of the shape of the excitation flow, which is being governed by the shape of the brain. We've got like just before the hippocampus, there's like a highly structured area that like basically does mapping. And like we actually can show that it's hexagonal, and that when you walk across a room, every like 3 meters, the same neuron fires in that direction, but not in any other direction. But then that's a little area, I forget its name, but it precedes another area that then does a higher level than that, which means that when you're in the corner of a room, that neuron fires, but it won't fire anywhere else. And it will fire in other houses that is like similar room situations, which is why you can get like weird senses of deja vu in places and stuff. And that stuff is hyper specific. So I think that there are some areas of the brain that are hyper specific for.
And there was also this Jennifer Aniston neuron, right? I think.
I didn't know it was called that. I think I know what you might be speaking about. I know that as the grandmother. Is it the grandmother neuron? Where like a specific, like a neuron fires for a particular person. Yeah, so I think our brain has high level representations that like layer on layer on layer on layer, and at each layer this is quite hard to explain. Like I remember doing some like being really fascinated by this because like there's a lot of knowledge about how our brain constructs higher level knowledge. Let me take an example that is a bit different, which is your eyesight, right? So your eye kind of sees, okay, I'll rephrase it. If you were to take a photo and you were to filter it out for certain like frequencies of feature, and by that I mean like the amount of change. So a high frequency feature is like a line where you get a change immediately from one moment to another. A low frequency feature is like a gradual gradient that changes gently over space. So if we think like in music terms, one of them's like the bass and the other one's like the high frequency like tweets or the violin at the top or something, or hi-hat. If you take a photo and you just pull out the features from different like wavelengths, so you cut 5 different wavelengths and you get one picture that is just the high frequency changes, which is just lines, which incidentally is roughly how cats see. They don't see like graded shapes, they just see edges. And then you have one that's like sort of a bit lower, and then the very bottom one is just like this really muddy gradient where it's like, if I was looking at you, there would just be this dark background and this sort of like brightish blob in the middle, and that's all there would be. If you then take 5 of those layers and you combine them into one image, human beings can't tell the difference between that and the original image. Because when you combine those layers, our brain goes, cool, I've got the information I need, because that's how we see. Cats have like 3 layers. They have got a much less graded visual system than we do. We see much more graded difference in light texture. And they see really sharp things because they're looking for mice, right? Whereas we're looking differently. So our brain does this everywhere, this sort of like layering concept. So when it comes to space, when it comes to stuff, it sort of decomposes the signal that we perceive. We don't really perceive the raw world the way it is. The philosophers are very much correct on that. We get all this signal in, and then our brain basically cuts vast amounts of it away for the sake of better processing, and often at particular frequencies. So some things will fire at so when you're walking through space, those hexagonal space cells, some of them will fire at high frequencies, some at low frequencies. And between that, you get a sense of distance because your brain then after that, in a layer that comes after it, recombines that stuff. So it's thrown away, most of it, but it's kept just enough layers to be able to recombine it and make sense of it. And then if you have that going layer after layer after layer, where each one does rough stuff, breaks it down, sends it to the next layer, which does its own version. After you've done I don't know how many, 5, 20, 50 of those layers, you end up with one neuron that just measures the feature change that's hyper-specific to something super abstracted away because it's been recombined and recombined and recombined again. And in your life, there's a moving feature that is that person. They are made up of a bunch of features that are lower level. If it's Jennifer Aniston, it would be her hair is probably a big part of it for pretty much most people because that's what she's famous for. And there's the Friends feature. And that's all backed by layers and layers and layers of interpretation and higher level abstraction. And then eventually one neuron goes, I recognize that. Whoa, that's me. But it's just a recombination. It's actually just a recombination. It's not really Jennifer Aniston. It's all the lower level frequencies through the whole layering that she triggers. So your grandmother will have one, but your grandmother will have a really rich one because there'll be the smell of her. There'll be all the memories and stuff. There's lots of ways of getting to your grandmother. But a celebrity is a relatively shallow concept. They're a really specific kind of signal, and they come together like that.
Yeah, because everyone associates them with this very few specific things.
Yeah, they're almost like an avatar or an archetype rather than a really complex human being. We don't really see them as people, which is why it's easier to yeah. I don't know if that made enough sense, but kind of just went off on one. But that's kind of what your brain does at lots of different layers. And I think that's one of the reasons, coming back to the bit that you were really asking about, which is brain plasticity. I think some features require a particular strong, custom-built layer that does that stuff really well. Right. So if you lose that bit of your brain that does that mapping, you will lose yourself in space and time. You just will. And I think, people who have struggles with their working memory, dyslexia. And that is because that part of the brain, that particular architectural function isn't working well. But when you go to the higher layers that do the abstraction, the Jennifer Aniston neurons and thing, at that point, I think you can probably lose quite a lot of your brain, and your brain will still do that layering thing. It'll just use whatever it's got. So it will still generate high-level abstractions with the neurons that it's got left in the neocortex. It may do less of them. It may do them in ways that are weird and differently interesting. In the same way that a cat can still see, but they really hyperfixate on lines. And we look at them and go, what the hell are they looking at? It's a dust mote or some weird line that we look at and go, I can't see anything there. But that's because our eye can see so much more that we grade it out and we don't notice it, whereas they do. And vice versa. They can't see things that we can see. So I think if you just take away half your brain will still do exactly the same job with the basics that it's got. So at that point, do you need it? But then you come back to the shape of your brain, and it's some of the areas of your brain might be the right shape for processing certain types of feature, certain types of phenomena. It may be the case that one of the reasons that your Wernicke's area on the left here is good at language is because it's the right shape for it. And you can do it somewhere else. But this one's just really good because it fits. Maybe. I don't really know. But that's a speculation because we do see things like that. If you damage yourself there, you're very likely to get word salad and language problems. So, but if you never had that, could you have built it somewhere else in your brain? Yeah, I mean, you have people who have encephalopathy. You can find people who are missing vast amounts of their brain. They got a gap in their head, literally, and you couldn't tell from the outside. Maybe not the most intelligent person, but they're functioning. They can do their teeth. They go shopping. They have conversations. You're wow. And then you have people who have the tiniest of injuries, just a tiny little lesion, an accident in childhood where someone punched them in the side of the head, and they lose all their language. And they can't speak. Yeah. Well, I'm in lecture mode today, clearly.
Yeah, that's fine because I'm not in talking mode at all. So that's good. What's your opinion on just gonna keep you in talking mode?
Let me speak again. Why don't you? Yeah. It's almost as if I like talking about this stuff.
What do you think about critical periods in the sense
I have no idea what that means.
key time frames for your brain to develop certain areas that
Yeah,
like
I
in
think
the
that's
different
unequivocal.
areas of
Yeah, I think that's unequivocal. I mean, I've been talking about this lately myself, actually, because I've been talking about empathy, with the events in America with the election of Trump, and trying to make sense of that, which I will confess has shaken my belief in people. And I've been thinking about empathy a lot. And I think, so I'll give two examples here. Language is a really good example. So our brains are capable of language. If you, like Noam Chomsky famously came up with this idea that, we kind of don't necessarily have to have language, but our brains are built in such a way that they really want to. So given half the chance, we will. But if at crucial stages of development in your childhood, you are not exposed to language, you basically can't learn it. Like it's done. You're not learning that. It's gone. You can't pick it up again. So there are, kids that have been discovered who've been like living in forests and stuff, like sort of Mowgli type stories where they've been raised by wolves, literally, or wild creatures or something like that. And they come out of the forest, as teenagers, and they never really learn to speak because they've missed that crucial period of time. I think empathy is the same. I think there's some really interesting historical analysis that suggests that, at least in the West, empathy kind of started with novels. Because before novels, people didn't look at the world from the perspective of other people. And then novels got invented, and then the rich aristocracy read novels, and they started seeing the world from other people's perspective. And there was this movement in Europe for decency and empathy. And the aristocrats basically imposed the concept of empathy on the populace, and the populace didn't care. But actually, there's a sort of strong argument that actually human beings, there's a strong argument that they are empathic in one level of empathy, one type of empathy, like immediate local effect empathy, like your immediate people, but like not necessarily generally to humanity. But that empathy actually broader than that is taught. And there is a correlation between, your education and your political stance, your spiritual stance, how religious you are, how empathic you are. Empathy is a difficult one because it has various different definitions, but there's some evidence to suggest that empathy is taught. Like you are taught morals and ethics by school, by parents. And if you're not, you just don't care about people in the same way. You might look after your immediate family, your immediate friends, but you just don't care about wider people. And I think that that's people voting for Trump who just actually at some level don't care. Like they're worried about their own price of eggs. They're worried about the things that are happening to them. They can see the fact that their job is on the line, and they do not care about some random person in another state who's having a very different life experience. They're like, just don't care. And they will vote for their own self-interest. And if you look at the political map and how people tend to vote politically and what it takes to get votes, I've been reassessing this and I used to think that people were like fundamentally good, less given a reason not to. And now I'm like, I don't know. I think maybe it's like language. If you're taught it when you're young, you can't get rid of it. If you're taught language when you're young, you'll never forget it. If you're taught empathy and you're taught morals and ethics when you're young, unless you're like legitimately a psychopath or a sociopath, you will have that, and you will walk through life going like, I have a moral compass, whether I like it or not. But people who aren't, don't. And I think that's because our brain is capable of it, but it doesn't necessarily happen unless we're taught. And that's the critical period. It has to happen at a certain time of life where we're brain's plastic and like interested in that.
Also, is there such a thing as a moral compass? I mean, there's many interpretations of what is morally good, right? I mean, I could come up with a few very common ones. Like, I think most people agree that killing a person is bad, but for the more
That's not been the case in the
thud-
history of humanity.
okay, well, that's
Like it just hasn't.
that's what I
Like,
mean. I mean, there's not a one opinion on what is morally good and bad, right?
there are
I
some
mean,
consistencies though. Like
sure,
all the
yeah,
religious traditions have certain consistencies.
there's
Like
consistencies.
do unto
Absolutely.
others like you would like done unto yourself is a pretty big one, which is empathy. But it's taught. Like if that shit was easy for human beings to understand, we wouldn't have had to invent loads of religions to try and teach it to people.
But then still, what I do not want to be done to me probably also differs from what you would say and would probably differ from
With
people who are much less like us.
to a degree, and I think there are certain major things that would be incredibly common. Like one of them is don't fuck with me, don't take away my agency, and don't cause me suffering. Note that I'm not saying pain,
Yeah, but
because some
how-
people quite like a bit of pain.
For
Yeah, but suffering is
example,
different from pain.
But what makes you suffer? That differs.
That's why you need empathy, because empathy isn't a rule. Like it's
But
not
how
like
can you be?
there's not
mean,
an
I do-
independent rule that says this is how you should treat other people. Empathy says, given that you're different, I'm going to make an effort to care about that difference and learn you. I'm going to be open to you telling me what your suffering is so that I can take it into account. Like that's empathy.
I do get that, but how would you apply empathy to a whole country the size of the US?
Well, I wouldn't
Or-
apply it. I would hope that people all had it. And I think if people all had it, then the emergent phenomena of social interaction would look very different. You know, like our societies would look different. I think cultures where empathy is well taught are nicer places to be. You're less at risk because it's less likely that someone will take advantage of you, because they're more likely to be like, well, I would also feel crap if I took advantage of you, because I would feel it because I have empathy. Even if I was struggling, right? If you've got empathy, even if you're struggling, you're less likely to harm other people for your own ends. And empathy is something that brains can do, right? Even rats do it, right? So here's another example. If you put two rats in a cage side by side, waterproof cages, and you pour water into one half of the cage, and then the rat on the other half doesn't have water, but has a button that they can press that lets the other rat out, like opens a door. The rat in the half of the cage that has the button, let's assume that they've been taught that the button opens the door. So they've already established, they know that already somehow. The rat on the other side of the cage will basically always let the rat that's about to drown out. A rat that's been on the drowning side will do it way faster because they have the empathy, they get it. So teaching empathy is about teaching a brain to consider and like imagine an experience they have not yet experienced that is like bad or negative or even good before they've had it, so that you can empathize. Like I don't need to be a poor minority demographic somewhere. I don't need to live that experience to be able to understand that they have certain hardships and struggles in life, because I never will. Like I'll never be able to understand that because I'm not that demographic, and I don't live in a society where I'm ever really going to be a minority like that. I mean, okay, I'm a minority for being neurodiverse, but yeah, I think that's why it's taught. And I think the brain works like that. I mean, I think our whole biological system works like that. There's a bunch of like stress hormones. To start with, one of the reasons that kids repeat actions all the time, they just repeat the same thing again and again. And an adult's like, you've got it. But for a very young child, it's not that simple, because some actions you can't repeat. You know, you drop a glass on the floor, it breaks. Some actions you can repeat. And young children have no idea which actions are or are not repeatable. So they will repeat a bunch of actions to be like, oh, this one actually carries on. And they're learning that facet of nature. So they will just keep putting that ball through that hole. They'll keep playing that game and retrying it and going, it's still the case that this square thing fits in the square hole. Huh, who'd have thought it? Because they've got nothing to work on, right? And that builds up, and our brain, what's his name? Erickson, Piaget Erickson. There's a bunch of like psychologists who study this, and it's very relevant for psychotherapy as well, because the point at where you have a stressful experience is often then locked in, and a lot of the time what you're actually working with in therapy isn't really an adult person. It's a child that's grown into an adult body but has got stuck somewhere because of a critical period that didn't fully resolve. And that's a psychological experience, but it's also a neurological reality. So I mean, your question was quite vague in the sense of, do they exist? Do I believe in them? And the answer is I 100% think I believe in them. Which ones? There's so many.
It was relevant to know whether you believe it exists, because the article that I found states that basically they think these critical periods arrive or happen earlier in people with autism than in other people. So what
So
they
there are
found,
some specific critical periods,
yeah,
or
so
generally all critical periods.
I think they haven't really divided that. What
That's
they
interesting.
found,
So
yeah,
it's like we mature, our brains not mature faster, but hit
that's
point.
literally what they
Because,
say.
like, rather famously, isn't it? Early talking early is one of the signs of autism. Like, if you're talking, it's not a given. But if you're speaking early and you're smart early, it's like, yeah, that's probably a neurodiverse kid right there. That's interesting. Which kind of fits with when we were, like, a few sessions ago, we were talking about how there's something that slows it down. I remember the metaphors. We were talking about the traffic lights, and we were talking about the marshals on the race stopping the Viking marauders. And we were talking about like vitamin D and vitamin K and like all the stuff that like does that slowing down effect. So this is another example. To me, it sounds like there's a shape of autistic neurodiverse brains like being a bit less guardrailed, a bit faster, a bit less patient, maybe not just in the moment, but across longer time frames as well. That's kind of what I'm hearing.
I have two details, like not focus on brain areas, but on other things. One is that the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, this is a thing that you can measure in the brain, and it has been shown to open critical periods. So if they increase this factor in mice, they tested it on mice, then it prematurely opens critical periods. So if they induce this factor in mice, then the mice will have these critical periods of brain development earlier than they would normally have. And this stuff that they put in mice, and then they would start their critical periods earlier, they found in larger amounts in autistic people. So that's one thing.
So that suggests that, I mean, just the top level definition that I've just found is that BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, plays an important role in neuronal survival and growth and serves as a neurotransmitter modulator, participating in neural plasticity, which is essential for learning and memory. So the suggestion there is basically like, if you flood your brain with this stuff, it gets a bit more plastic, right? And for the benefit of listeners who don't know what plastic means here, plastic doesn't mean that it looks like, plastic in the sense of metal and wood and plastic. It just means changeable. So like plasticine is a, so Play-Doh that you can play with again and again and again. So plastic in this context means changeable. So a plastic brain is a brain that is capable of change and relearning, or being flown at by a fly. So basically, that sort of implies that without BDNF, our brains kind of like crystallize a bit and become a bit static, and you put that in, and basically it makes us a bit more like liquid. So it almost like makes your brain a bit looser so that it can reform new structures.
Exactly. And what happens in critical periods is that the brain becomes especially plastic in certain areas so that they can develop extremely fast in a specific period of life.
Interesting. I would speculate that we would then experience waves of that where during development we may well see, because this would be universal, right? So if you're flooded with this, it's going to impact everything. And that's great for learning. But the flip side of that is that it's probably super high energy. It's probably really expensive to do that for like energetically and in your brain in terms of like nutrients needed to do the stuff that's being done. And it's probably quite unstable, right? So because you're going to lose stuff that was actually fine because you've kind of softened it and melted it again, which means that I would speculate that your brain's going to want to do this in waves, where it goes, right, let's shake everything up, and then it's stop, like let's take stock, let's see how we're doing with this, and then there's maybe grow the body for a bit and do some physical growth, and then go, right, now let's do another or maybe they're correlated, maybe they happen at the same time, I don't know. But like there's definitely stuff like when you're 15 and stuff like that, your brain like kills vast amounts of itself as well. Like your brain literally goes and just sort of commits self-destructs like half your neural connections, which is crazy. So you lose loads of stuff. So this is going to have to create loads of stuff, but it's going to affect everything. If it's going to affect one thing, it's going to flood you, and it'll affect all the systems in your brain, presumably, if it's more present.
The article isn't saying if this factor was present like in specific areas or when exactly. The other specificity that they give is, I'm going to read this, is that brain volume in people with autism increases rapidly from below normal. So the brain volume, the amount of brain that a person has, at birth, it is in autistic babies, it's below normal, it's below average compared to non-autistic babies, I suppose, increases to 10 to 12% larger at 2 to 4 years old.
Well, I've definitely got autism then because I've got a whopping great head. I don't fit any hats because my head's too bloody big for them.
Well, but then this insane growth ends around 2 years of age, and then it kind of decreases again. So basically what they mean is that the brain grows very quickly when the child is very young. But then after that, for all the other babies, it grows as well. The autistic baby brains just grow much earlier, have this
Interesting
peak like 2 years earlier than the other babies.
This kind of, for me, it feels like this modulation theme that we find again and again. Autistic brains are sort of less modulated. We have noisier neuronal connections. We have faster stuff that isn't as slowed down. It's like often in our exploration, the theme seems to be that autism is, a slightly almost like a more violent experience, like just faster, right? More and faster and harder, but with the costs that come with that. And this sort of fits that pattern a bit, doesn't it? And I wonder what the trigger is, right? Like baby turtles going to the sea is like, well, that's the moon, right? So I wonder if, it won't be this, but let's imagine that if neurons in an autistic brain make more noise as they grow, the brain's noisier. What if the noisiness of the brain, or just like if you just counted all the number of pulses the brain had ever done, and when it hits 14 trillion, which it won't be because it's a ridiculous number, probably way too small, right? But when it hits 14 trillion whatever, then boom, that triggers that moment. Then if you've got a noisier brain, that trigger is going to happen faster. So I'd be really curious what triggers these growth spurts and stop spurts, because it sort of all feels, it won't be the number of spikes, it will be something much more biochemical, right? But if that's being influenced by the amount that's being used by neuronal activity, then it kind of is actually the number of spikes, but just a proxy. And then we're kind of consistently in this theme of an autistic brain is maybe a bit more like a... Do you know, I've been playing a bit of music lately. If I was just to sing into this microphone, which I promise you I won't do, because much as I'm working on my singing, I'm not quite there yet, and I think it would be quite horrendous. If I just sing into this microphone as I am, I'm going to peak the sound levels, and I'm going to be too quiet and too loud. I'm going to be all over the place. And what you do when you're doing the sound engineering on it is you put something on it called a compressor. And a compressor takes the highs and takes the lows, and it just squashes the whole thing into a bit of a neat band to stop it going overside, but keeping a nice dynamic range. And without a compressor, audio sounds bad. So when you listen to good music that's been well done by a sound engineer, they've done loads of stuff to kind of bring everything in and move it around and drop certain frequencies to make sure that it doesn't drown the flute or the voice. Different bits sit in different places. There's all this management of the stuff. It's not the raw sound itself. It's a load of stuff that gets added on to manage the sound afterwards. And I kind of get the sense that the autistic brain is like, it's just the raw sound. Like our modulation stuff, something. It's like when we were talking about the barriers, we sort of came across this idea that there's this, I can't remember what it was called. There was this one thing that made was it a protein that made the blood-brain barrier, maybe all barriers, a bit less effective. And then that leads us to the immune theory where we were like, hold on, but if that's affecting lots of barriers, then, where you see that, you see autistic behavior because it's the common factor. And we were kind of going, is this a common factor, this barrier protein that does barriers in the body in various places? And I'm wondering whether this, the BDNF, and all it takes is one thing that gets used in lots of places to do modulation. And if it modulates everything, from the momentary speed of this thing to the big shifts of life, like those images I was saying earlier when we take an image and you break it into its different frequencies. If there's just one thing that's messing up on modulation, then we're just like, we're just raw sound. Like the raw chaos of the world, slightly less filtered. It's just harder to work with because it's just more signal, more noise, just more energy, harder to deal with. And maybe neurotypicals just have a slightly damped version of the world that's just easier to deal with. Lucky buggers.
But that's also that's not even necessarily related to these critical periods, right? Because other people also have the critical periods. People with autism just have them earlier. But then what you're saying relates more to the pruning deficit, I suppose.
I'm kind of wondering whether it's all related. Like, for example, let's say that, like taking the music metaphor again, right? If you've got a peak limiter that kicks in when you peak and it cuts the noise, right? If you've got a noisier brain, that's going to kick in earlier. The consequence of kicking earlier is going to be like, shut down something, but it shuts it down earlier. Whereas if you never peaked earlier, then this thing doesn't get triggered and then you don't have the consequence of that being triggered. It's all just softer, maybe a bit more manageable. I didn't know about so when you said critical periods, I was treating that as very much a sort of psychotherapeutic, like phases are really important. I didn't know that there was a actual single thing that gets released in the brain that like makes that stuff happen and basically like liquefies your brain, like not literally, but I'm one of the things I'm noticing in our exploration is that like I had a conversation with someone the other day who was like, but it's all a spectrum, isn't it? We're all on the spectrum. And I was like, yeah, no, not really. Like, nah. I used to say that as well, but I'm kind of off that myself now. I'm like, no, I think it's sort of a bit more discreet. Like, I think if you've got autism, you've got autism. Or if you are autistic, you are autistic. It's like, and I just wonder whether there are just a few things fundamentally at play that maybe in that CNNF genetic place that we were talking about right at the beginning, CXX, what's it called? I can't remember half the stuff we spoke about. My memory's terrible.
The RCCX, yeah.
RCCX, that's the one. Whether there are actually just a few co-located proteins or factors, like things that our body makes, that influence all these different systems and cascade up through the layers because they affect something at a low level that is just fundamentally structural.
You just said probably people, or maybe like people just have autism or they don't have it.
I'm currently feeling more aligned with that interpretation than the others.
To me, that doesn't really make sense because that would mean that there is a thing present that there isn't present in other people, whereas I think we all have the same stuff in our brains. It's just present in different amounts and different ratios, and that has an effect.
Yes. I guess what I'm interested in is like when you're looking at studying complex systems, you get something called nonlinear effects. So you can change an underlying influencing variable smoothly, but the system will respond by doing nothing, and then suddenly. So I don't know if you remember doing like chemistry at school and you did titration, you'd add a drop and 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 then you'd add a drop and then boom, the thing went red
and at some point,
or blue or purple, right? Because suddenly it's not being soaked up anymore and suddenly there's an excess. So that's a really simple example of something where, you can put more in, but it doesn't change the outcome because there's enough soak in the system. And then boom, you go over that and now you're in a different world. This thing now has an effect. And that's a discrete shift in like observed phenomenon as a result. So if something low level in your brain is like that to start with, it's like, you're just shifting a spectrum, but a consequent system shifts gear when that spectrum goes up. And then if that thing shifts gear and it's itself deep scaffolding for a lot of the other stuff of your brain, then it's going to really discreetly change how everything else follows from there. So yes, there is a driving spectrum, but just because the original driver changes smoothly doesn't mean you don't have nonlinear effects that exhibit discretely. And I'm kind of leaning toward the idea, I think that autistic brains, something that moves smoothly has crossed a line where it's triggered a certain quality of effect and deeply structural. Like if your barrier proteins have become weak, boom, like then they're fine. They can survive. No, that's too much. Now I'm opening the holes too wide. And then you start leaking. And there might still be a spectrum there where, you go from leaking a bit to leaking a lot. But as soon as you start leaking, you're in the leaky world. That may or may not be, like, that one might be smooth. I don't know. But also we were talking about this neotropic factor, like if it's earlier, if it's before or after a certain critical point, like for example, that cortisol thing, it's a month. Like it changes between different people when that month happens, but it's basically always around 2. And that's like in the scope of your life, that's a pretty sharp boundary. That's a few days, really. Like it was some small number of days. And in that small number of days, you go from have no equilibrium and I'm fine with anything and cope to boom, here's my baseline. So it could also be a temporal thing. It could be like a lock-in. I think there are a lot of questions still open on all this stuff, aren't there? So my sense is just that I'm beginning to feel like I'm drawn to this idea that there are some really deep scaffolding phenomena at play for autistic people that cascades up through the layers. And we're so busy looking at the consequences and the phenomenon and going, people with autism have this and that and this and that and that. I'm like, they're all just consequences. They're all like, they're the Jennifer Aniston neuron going crazy after it's been processed by layers and layers and layers and layers of neurons before it. It just strikes me that there's too many different things being affected, but with similar themes everywhere. That I'm like, yeah, why not? Why not hypothesize that there might be a small number of critical things? And, if they do come back to the RCCX and they're all co-located on a bit of DNA that mutates together, then it might be like, it takes 2 or 3 of these to change for the impact to happen and go nonlinear. It might just be one, right? But I'm so glad people are researching this, and I very much look forward to continuing to read their research and making more sense. I feel like my understanding of it is vastly moving along. It's both more complex and more simple somehow. I want to see the evidence for the theory. That's what I want to see. I want to see people really study this and like find the next layer of questions, probably.
Point. That's how research works usually.
So, well, should we call it there for today?
Yeah, I think so.
Wait again next time. Well, thank you for the conversation today.
You too.
See you next week.
See you next week.
If it's all right with you, I'll hit record again because I actually think that this really matters. You all right with that? And I'm asking that, dear listeners, because we're talking about periods of menstruation, because I made a little comment when we finished our session about Meryl being not quite as exuberant today as in other sessions. And the thing is, we often don't mention this, but actually, hormonal cycles make a mad big difference and are really important. And there is a correlation between PMDD and neurodiversity. PMDD is premenstrual something dysphoria.
Yeah. I think, I'm not sure, but I think the first P can be either pre or post. I think some people experience it before and some people after. Could also be the case. I'm not sure.
Well, why don't we just, we consider it perimenstrual, which means around it is and
disorder? No.
No, dysphoria is the bit that captures the bit. So PMDD, brain fog is I just Googled PMDD and the first suggestion is PMDD brain fog. So the technical, Jesus, that's pretty harsh. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Like 1D wasn't enough. It's like, no. This shit is it's really bad. And obviously I can't speak to this, but I dislike the naming here. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder is a mood disorder that causes severe emotional, cognitive, and physical symptoms in the week or 2 before menstruation. And I think it's absolutely disgraceful that they call it disorder because some women just can have this and it's normal for them. Like pretty judgmental.
Well, it is disordering.
It's impactful,
right? So it is comorbid with neurodiversity, but why?
Why don't we find out? Why don't we have a look at that? I think that's because half of the people who have neurodiversity are going to be impacted by this. Actually, do you know what? I'd be really interested in discovering whether testosterone, I'm willing to bet that our hormone cycles are so massive and they're so important for men and women. We know the female cycle more overtly, we talk about it more, although we really don't talk about it a lot. But it's really important. But men also have, I think, 3 distinct testosterone cycles they've begun to identify. And we totally ignore that. But actually, it has a really big impact on men. I would be really interested in talking about this area for all of us, no matter which hormonal body experience we're having. I'm pretty sure there's going to be some intense interactions. So should we explore that? Put a pin in that one for next time.
Sure. Didn't even know about the testosterone cycles.
You know, I've done loads of men's work and I barely know about it either. I'm like, yeah, there's something there, but I haven't really gone to town on it. Like, you know, biophysiologically. I don't know. I'd like to. One thing that I am of the opinion there, one thing I believe, that I've come to believe from things I have read, is that women's cycles are more internally driven. Like your cycle is about your internals, whereas testosterone is quite a reactive hormone. So we're influenced by outer things more. Like it's more reactive, which means that the process of learning to deal with it, right? So as a human being needing to learn to self-regulate our experience, a woman can learn to regulate her hormonal cycle by tuning in and learning how to regulate self and from within, like your own thing. So if you're looking at this from a spiritual perspective, you know, what's the spiritual journey that you're going to go on? Because not everyone's interested in the science. So the spiritual angle is like, how do you live? So a lot of women are engaging with this from that angle. And the discovery there is like, you know, rooting in your own self, your own rhythm, your own knowledge. And I notice a lot of women that I know who are on those journeys are having like really powerful impacts on their life. What I notice among men is different, which is that our struggle seems to be regulating with respect to external impositions, like what's being asked of us and how we are impacted and how we respond and like what comes up for us in response to things. And like a lot of what we talk about is regulating that. So obviously everyone has internal stuff and everyone has external stuff. It's just like a different, like estrogen, progesterone driven bodies and testosterone driven bodies are going to have different shapes of, you know, things being more salient than others. I'm trying to walk that line without going like, it's like, we have that too. It's like, yes, everyone has everything. Well done. But there are differences in shape. And there's something about testosterone being like it rides us in ways that are reactive, and we really have to be taught. As men, we have to be taught to control and manage in ways that, certainly in the spiritual literature, learn it from within. That's one for next time and onwards. All right, talk soon.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to our podcast today. If you like what we're talking about and want to hear more, do like, follow, and subscribe. It makes a really big difference. You can also find us on social media and our Patreon, Al and Meryl, or our website, alandmeryl.com. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.